We all get afraid and feel fear. Seeing a spider, a loud noise or a creak on floorboard late at night can strike fear suddenly right through our bodies. The feeling of fear can make your heart race, breath quicken, scream, sweat pupils dilate, freeze you in place and can even cause involuntary urination. These are all stress reactions caused by our limbic system, a chain reaction in areas of the brain that work together to control a built-in fight or flight response. We have this built into us to help us react to and survive threats. If not for fear, we would most likely not have survived as a species. Lots of people actually seek out fear, enjoying being and feeling scared. Watching horror films, playing scary games or even going on a roller coaster. When our fight or flight response is triggered, we release chemicals which are similar to that of when we are excited or happy. When we trigger this in what we perceive as a safe environment, it is thought that we can then enjoy being scared and the chemicals running around our body that are akin to high arousal states.
Scientists use a technique known as Psychomotor Vigilance Tasks, or PVTs, to understand the impact of sleep deprivation on humans in studies. Simply put, it's a reaction test. A red button randomly turns green, and people have to push it as fast as possible. Not so surprisingly, those who get 8 hours of sleep over a 2-week period show very few lapses in attention and no cognitive declines. But those groups that receive either 6 or 4 hours of sleep see declining PVT results on almost a daily basis for the entire 2-week period. Of course, the 4-hour group performs the worst. But these results don't just show a loss of concentration, they show full lapses in awareness called microsleeps. In other words, their brains aren't just slower, but shutting off for moments at a time. When looking at the results deeper, scientists concluded that getting 6 hours of sleep for 10 days in a row was the same as not sleeping for 24 hours straight. That's the same cognitive decline as being legally drunk. And if you get 4 hours of sleep for 11 days, it's like you haven't slept for 48 hours straight.
But if not trying to escape, and trying too hard, are both bad choices, then what are you supposed to do if you get stuck in quicksand? The trick is to stay calm. First, get rid of any heavy items that you're wearing or carrying, as they'll only drag you deeper. Then, try to lean as far back as you can to create more space for yourself. Water will come in and fill the gaps you create, which will make it easier for you to move and pull your body towards the surface. If you can, grab a stick and wedge it underneath your back. This will help to increase your leverage. Hopefully, you'll get help from emergency services. But if not, you can use these tips to get out on your own. It will be a long and exhausting process since, just to free your foot from a puddle of quicksand, moving at a rate of 1 centimeter per second, it would require the same amount of force as it does to lift a small car. And once you're free, you'll probably be in a lot of pain. With all that pressure from the densely packed sand, you might emerge in the quicksand with permanent nerve damage, or without a leg. If you do manage to come out in one piece, well, maybe tread a little more carefully in the future. But don't let this one sucky experience keep you from another adventure. Put your best foot forward, and take a walk on the wild side.
Here are 5 steps to develop a strong research question. Step 1. Choose a broad topic. Go with the topic that sparks your interest, since you'll be spending quite some time with it. For me, I'm thinking maybe something about social media. Step 2. Do some preliminary reading about the topic. Okay, so I've read a lot of newspaper writing about how social media negatively impacts high school students' academic performances. And they also happen to be one of the most active age groups on social media. Step 3. Narrow down to a specific niche. This way, you can make sure the research is within a feasible scope instead of something too broad to achieve in a given time frame. Since academic performance is too broad, let me narrow it down to attention span. Step 4. Identify a research problem. So we have already established that adolescents are one of the most active age groups on social media platforms. But only a scarce amount of research has been done on the effect of social media has on the younger generation's attention span. So this will be my research problem. Step 5. Write your research question. Turning your research problem into a question. And it sounds something like, what effect does daily use of Twitter have on the attention span of people in the age group of 16 to 20? Since this is a descriptive research, the research question is also descriptive. But there are also other kinds of research questions. It all depends on the type of research you'll do. For example, comparative research, descriptive research, or correlational research.
Essentially, when the brain sees something that's novel, it has to burn more energy to represent it because it wasn't expecting that. This feeling that things are going in slow motion is a trick of memory. In other words, when you're in an emergency situation, a part of the brain called the amygdala comes online. This is your emergency control center. It lays down memories on what amounts to a secondary memory track. These are very dense memories. And you're noticing everything around you and writing it all down. So when the brain reads that back out, there's such a density of memory there that the brain's only conclusion is that must have taken a long time. And I think this offers an explanation for why people think that time seems to speed up as they grow older. And it's because when you're a child, everything's new to you. You're figuring out the rules of the world, you're writing down a lot of memory, and so when you look back at the end of a year, you have a lot of memory of what you've learnt. But when you're much older and you look back at the end of the year, you're probably doing approximately the same stuff you've been doing for the X number of previous years. And so it seems like the year just went by in a flash.
Why do we snore? Is there a bigger issue? Well, it's quite simple, really. People snore when they're having a really boring dream, or when I'm doing my stand-up routine. See, lights out. I'm still working on the jokes. But for real, Mayo Clinic defines snoring as the hoarse or harsh sound that occurs when air flows past relaxed tissues in your throat, causing the tissues to vibrate as you breathe. People can snore due to a variety of reasons. Allergies or a cold might do it, as well as alcohol consumption or sleep deprivation. A person's weight could also play a factor. Even just the anatomy of your mouth and sinuses could play a part. No matter the puzzle pieces that add up to a person snoring, it could be a sign of a bigger issue, known as obstructive sleep apnea or OSA. Now, not every snorer has this condition, even if their snoring is chronic, but OSA could be a serious condition that should be addressed by a medical professional.
The structure of a language forces us to attend to certain aspects of language at the moment of using that language. It's known as the thinking for speaking hypothesis. There's evidence that language involves some kind of image simulation and that has a consequence for how we perceive of certain events. Color is quite a complex property of a visual world. Your brain is decoding color in quite a complicated way. So you have many languages that have a term to denote both green and blue, and typically we call this a GRU term. You find this in languages like the Himba, for example, in the Namibian plains. In this experiment, we asked participants to look at the color tile, and then after 30 seconds we show them the full array of colors and we say, "Now, pick the one that you just saw." And it's a very difficult task if you're an English speaker, but a Himba speaker can do it like child's play because that color is central to them. You simply cannot recognize colors that are not easily encoded in your native language.
Ultimately, the most important thing for learning is not the way the information is presented but what is happening inside the learner's head. People learn best when they're actively thinking about the material, solving problems or imagining what happens if different variables change. I talked about how and why we learn best in my video, The Science of Thinking, so check that out. Now, the truth is, there are many evidence-based teaching methods that improve learning. Learning styles is just not one of them. And it is likely, given the prevalence of the learning styles misconception, that it actually makes learning worse. I mean, learning styles give teachers unnecessary things to worry about, and they make some students reluctant to engage with certain types of instruction. And all the time and money spent on learning styles and related training could be better spent on interventions that actually improve learning. You are not a visual learner, nor an auditory learner, nor a kinesthetic learner, or more accurately, you are all these kinds of learner in one. The best learning experiences are those that involve multiple different ways of understanding the same thing. And best of all, this strategy works not just for one subset of people but for everyone.
Too often in marriage, we make sacrifices, and we demand them, without reckoning their cost. But there is wisdom in looking at the price tags attached to our marital decisions in just the way that divorce law teaches us to do. What I want is for people to think about their marital bargains through the lens of divorce. And to ask, how is marriage a sacrifice, but an exchange of sacrifice? How do we think about our exchange? Second, how do we think about childcare and deal with the fact that there is no such thing as free childcare? How do we deal with the fact that some things can be separate, and if we don't think about it, then it will all be part of the joint enterprise? So basically, what I want to leave you with is that in marriage or divorce, people should think about the way that till death do us part, marriage is forever.
Great feedback givers begin their feedback by asking a question that is short but important. It lets the brain know that feedback is actually coming. It would be something, for example, like, "Do you have 5 minutes to talk about how that last conversation went?" Or, "I have some ideas for how we can improve things. Can I share them with you?" This micro yes question does two things for you. First of all, it's going to be a pacing tool. It lets the other person know that feedback is about to be given. And the second thing it does is it creates a moment of buy-in. I can say yes or no to that yes or no question. And with that, I get a feeling of autonomy. The second part of the feedback formula is going to be giving your data point. Here, you should name specifically what you saw or heard, and cut out any words that aren't objective. There's a concept we call blur words. A blur word is something that can mean different things to different people. Blur words are things that are not specific. So for example, if I say, "You shouldn't be so defensive," or, "You could be more proactive." What we see great feedback givers doing differently is they'll convert their blur words into actual data points. So for example, instead of saying, "You know you aren't reliable," we would say, "You said you'd get that email to me by 11, and I still don't have it yet." Specificity is also important when it comes to positive feedback, and the reason for that is that we want to be able to specify exactly what we want the other person to increase or diminish. And if we stick with blur words, they actually won't have any clue, particularly what to do going forward to keep repeating that behavior.
Organizations are far more likely to keep information on that attack to themselves. Why? Because they're worried about competitive advantage, litigation or regulation. We need to effectively democratize threat intelligence data. We need to get all of these organizations to open up and share what is in their private arsenal of information. The bad guys are moving fast. We've got to move faster. And the best way to do that is to open up and share data on what's happening. Let's think about this in the construct of security professionals. Remember, they're programmed right into the DNA to keep secrets. We've got to turn that thinking on its head. We've got to get governments, private institutions and security companies willing to share information at speed. And here's why. Because if you share the information, it's equivalent to inoculation. And if you're not sharing, you're actually part of the problem, because you're increasing the odds that other people could be impacted by the same attack techniques.
Getting back to PTSD, another type of non-declarative memory is emotional memory. Now, this has a specific meaning in psychology and refers to our ability to learn about cues in our environment and their emotional and motivational significance. What do I mean by that? Well, think of a cue like the smell of baking bread, or a more abstract cue like a 20-pound note. Because these cues have been pegged with good things in the past, we like them and we approach them. Other cues, like the buzzing of a wasp, elicit very negative emotions and quite dramatic avoidance behavior in some people. Now, I hate wasps. I can tell you that fact. But what I can't give you are the non-declarative emotional memories for how I react when there's a wasp nearby. I can't give you the racing heart, the sweaty palms, that sense of rising panic. I can describe them to you, but I can't give them to you.
Walls and fences are often built with the intention of security. security from another group of people, from crime, from illegal trades. But walls and fences only provide us with a feeling of security, which is different from real security. Even though they might make us feel safe, the structures themselves can't protect us. Instead, they do something else. They separate. They create an us and a them. They establish an enemy. Walls make us build a second wall in our head, a mental wall. And those mental walls slowly make us lose sight of all the things we have in common with the people on the other side. The other way around, mental walls can grow so strong that they encourage us to build, keep, or strengthen physical walls. Physical and mental walls are closely interlinked, and one almost always comes with the other. It's a constant cycle. Physical walls empower mental walls, and mental walls empower physical walls, until at one point, one part falls away, and the cycle is disrupted.
Chopsticks are used in a huge portion of the world across much of Asia. About 1.5 billion people are covered in the chopstick sphere. Different cultures have slightly different variations of chopsticks. Chinese chopsticks will tend to be long and round, Korean chopsticks, which are flatter, and often made of metal, and Japanese chopsticks tend to be round, and very, very pointy. While chopsticks are actually really commonplace in American society today, there was definitely a time in the late 1800s where this idea that Asian men, because they ate rice with sticks, were of a different quality than American men who ate proper meat with knife and fork. But, when China and the United States began their diplomatic engagement in the 1970s, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger had to practice eating with chopsticks. What's been really interesting to see is that as Asian cuisine has moved from the East into the West, chopsticks have become part of the experience. There's evidence of chopsticks as long ago as the Shang dynasty, which was about 3,000 years ago. And they loved tripods during the Shang dynasty, so, when you cook with these big tripods, chopsticks were actually really useful because it was a way for you to stir and to reach without getting burned as the water was boiling in these really big pots. Chinese culture has knives and has forks, that uses them in many cases for cooking, but in terms of what moved into the dining room, it was the chopsticks.
I came up with 3 principles as the guiding principles for a just city, the principles of equity, democracy, and diversity. These were derived from the works of a number of philosophers, most preeminently, I suppose, John Rawls. My choice of the word equity rather than equality is in fact based on Rawls's argument that a policy ought to distribute benefits to people where the worst off become better off. So the worst off don't have to become equal to everybody else, but no policy should in fact make those who are most disadvantaged more disadvantaged. And it means that we have to talk about the policy at the time it's being enacted. To say, well, we have to make our city more competitive because sometime in the by and by, the benefits will trickle down to those people who are worst off, doesn't justify making them worst off at the time. We have a lot of examples in the world of people whose homes were destroyed in the name of the greater good and said, well, eventually they will benefit. But equity means that you do not, in fact, take advantage of those people who are weakest.
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible, with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories, and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories, and the smog soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it, it's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world.
Alexis de Tocqueville, as we have noted, appears to have had some appeal to both ends of the political spectrum, left and right, or rather, both have found him to be useful for their purposes in certain circumstances. His rational acceptance of the new forces of democracy brought about by the American and French revolutions made him an icon of left-wing liberals. However, during the Cold War, that is, from the end of World War II until the collapse of communism, he was adopted by some leading thinkers on the right. So there are two sides to his political philosophy and the man himself that we need to look at. Now, I would suggest that de Tocqueville's biography is important here. You must always bear in mind, when reading him, that he was an aristocrat, and one whose family had suffered in the French Revolution. He wasn't your typical aristocrat, because his politics differed from others of his family and social rank. He abandoned the Catholic Church and married beneath his class. Yet he never quite threw off the prejudices of that class. However, and what is important, he did recognize and believe that the tendency of history, which in those days could be traced back to the Middle Ages, was towards the levelling of social ranks and more equal and democratic conditions. The French Revolution had in the end brought Napoleon, whom he hated, but democracy would inevitably come to France. His trip to America was to see democracy in practice, make note of its shortcomings and errors, and then find safeguards against them.
Most of what the general public knows about daily life in ancient Rome comes from art, architecture and literature, which tell us more about the elites, especially, the goings-on of the emperors. But how much do we know of the lives of ordinary Romans? Did they have a voice? Apart, that is, from what we can gather from graffiti. The usual picture is one of time spent at festivals, baths and typically the games. However, for many Romans, terrible living conditions, poverty, debt and the chance of being sold into slavery at any moment, that is, if they weren't slaves already, left no time or energy for such forms of entertainment, or for any interest in politics for that matter. Indeed, after the death of Augustus, executive power was taken from the elected assemblies of the Roman people. Now it was the emperor's job to look after the people, and his generosity often depended on the mood and behaviour of the people, on how often and how violently they protested and rioted. One example would be Claudius ensuring a steady grain supply, even in winter, after rioters pelted him with stale crusts of bread. There is an anecdote about Hadrian. While touring the provinces, an old lady approached him with a complaint. He made excuses and tried to get away. She said that if he wouldn't give her a hearing, he shouldn't be emperor. She got her hearing.
There was a time when the subject of happiness was the business of philosophers, as part of their discussion of what makes for the good life. Then, much later, psychologists and sociologists got in on the act, and now, it seems, so has the government. I understand that governments should have the welfare and well-being of those it governs at heart, from the purely practical point of view of keeping people quiet, at home enjoying their gadgets and comfort, rather than on the streets rioting. But surely it's not something you can legislate for. Today, there are numerous journals on the topic, and it is even included in the curriculum at some universities and colleges. Surveys are done, statistics compiled, graphs drawn, yet all they seem to prove is what most people have concluded themselves from personal experience. An obvious example would be that having a lot of money doesn't necessarily make you happy. We all wish to be happy and have ideas about what it is we think would make us so. But we also know or suspect that it's not that easy. Most of us learn that it is a byproduct of something else, usually being totally absorbed or involved in some task or pastime, and can only be reached that way. These activities, of course, must be worthwhile in themselves.
As physicists tried to explain the masses of particles, they found that if they just tried to inject the mass into the mathematical equations in the most straightforward way, just put a parameter for the mass of a particle right into the math didn't work. It gave rise to quantum mechanically inconsistent features. So it was recognized that you needed to have a more subtle way of introducing mass into the equations that would not spoil the fundamental symmetries, but yet would allow the particles to have different masses. You see, fundamentally, the idea is that all particles begin life as being massless. There's a high degree of symmetry associated with that. All of the particles have the same mass, 0. How do you inject mass without spoiling that symmetry, which is vital for the equations to make sense? The Higgs field does that. By immersing everything in this bath, this molasses-like bath, it turns out that the equations allow you to have your cake and eat it. The fundamental symmetries are deeply preserved, and yet the way in which the particles move, experiencing different resistance-like drag force, allows them to have different masses.
Conduct disorder in children is very serious. It's a disorder of childhood and adolescence that is long-term, that's chronic, where children have very aggressive impulses, where children are involved in difficulties with the law and really seem to have no disregard for the rules or for authority. When children have conduct disorder, they're definitely at risk of carrying these difficulties into adulthood, which also brings about a myriad of different problems. Children with conduct disorder often have difficulties in schools, have difficulty with relationships, and have difficulty with employment and lifelong, long-term relationships. It's important to recognize that if your child is not doing well in school, if your child has had difficulties where legal action was necessary, if your child is bullying, getting into fights, and this is constant and ongoing, if your child does not get help, these complexities will really exacerbate into other major difficulties. Look for signs of your child's grades dropping. Look for signs of repeated detentions, suspensions, and brushes with the law. Parents, please recognize that if your child has signs of conduct disorder, the sooner you get help, the sooner your child can start to learn more adaptive behaviors.
So there are two theories for how the gas giants formed. One is the same theory I showed you just now, core accretion, right? And the other is called disk instability. And one of our colleagues at DTM has done a lot of work on that. And so it's unclear exactly how they formed, but you're right, what we're trying to do, the reason we're trying to get to higher and higher pressure in the lab is because we're trying to understand more about the pressure inside the gas giants. It's thought that the gas giants also have a metallic core, but maybe a metallic core not made of iron. Hydrogen, for example, becomes metallic at a certain pressure. Okay, so it's very possible that the insides of these planets could have metallic cores, could have hydrogen cores, could have rocky portions. We're not sure, but the higher pressure we can get in the lab, the higher the pressure we can get in the lab, the closer we can get to understanding the interiors of the gas giants and the exoplanets that are so big.
Hello everyone. Today's lecture is about setting up a website. I'm going to be focusing on things that you need to consider to ensure your website really adds value to the people using it. So, there are three main areas you need to think about. The first and most important thing is who is your target audience. When you're creating a new website, you really need to think about who the users are and what information they'll be looking for. What we do when we set up websites is to group users based on their needs. So, for a website in the academic community, for example, we may have groups such as researchers and administrators, and this helps us design the site and add information that is relevant to each group. The second point is accessibility. The main thing here is to ensure your website can be found. And you can do this by making sure it can be reached from areas on the web where your target audience are also active. So this may mean providing links on other websites, or maybe using social media. And thirdly, retention. Making sure your target audience return to your website regularly. You do this by ensuring it gives them a reason to come back, so it's important to keep the site up to date and make sure it provides the latest news and interesting information and so on.
Supersymmetry is a mathematical idea that people have developed in effort to understand the sharpest organizing principle for the fundamental constituents of matter. You see, we have learned that particles that seem to be different can actually secretly be united by certain symmetry principles. So we're used to the fact that there are symmetric objects in the world like a sphere or a basketball. You turn a sphere, and even though you've transformed it, it looks the same fundamentally. We found that certain particles, when you transform one particle into another, even though it looks like the identity of the particle has changed, overall the equations describing it, they don't change at all, an underlying level of symmetry. But what we've not been able to do is find a symmetry that would relate certain kinds of particles, namely matter particles and force particles. Matter particles are particles like electrons and muons, quarks. Force particles are like photons and gluons and WZ bosons. Supersymmetry is a symmetry that actually relates these two kinds, these two classes of particles. And people have proven that supersymmetry is the last possible symmetry of the fundamental particles that our mathematics, reality, has not yet been shown to make use of. So people are now trying to see whether that symmetry might actually be at work in the world. Can we find evidence for it in our understanding of the fundamental particles?
Age of what Venus might be like on its surface, and so this was looking at the planet Venus. It was science fiction and science fact all the way up to 56 before the start of the space age, but it wasn't completely disproved, this idea of a really sort of lush environment on Venus, until 1967, which is when the first measurements in detail were done at Venus. So Venera 4 and Mariner 5 confirmed the feeling from an earlier space mission that in fact the surface of Venus was not like this at all, but extremely hot, and also that the clouds were made of sulfuric acid, so there wasn't a nice water cycle like is going on in this picture. But it had to wait for these in situ measurements by a spacecraft to actually do that. And so Venus turned out not to be quite as Earth-like as we thought. And I'll sort of tell you about some of the latest results from Venus Express, which say actually there are some Earth-like features, but to a large extent it's not like the Earth. Okay, so a brief comparison between
Okay, so this is the big benefit of a universal philosophy. It says it applies to everybody. Well, looks, that doesn't, 205 or 206 countries in the world, and you've got something that applies to everybody. It's a bit strange, isn't it? No. It says liberal theory. There are some value structures that apply to all of us. You couldn't have the United Nations without it. It couldn't tell you that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights without this idea of values that apply to all of us just because we are humans. Now, the idea is to test that as well. Why is sport universal? Why does everybody play football? It's because the values are specified at a very thin level at the top. There are these rules, and we all have to abide by just these rules. But there are lots of things about football that aren't rules specified. So Brazilian football is different from Italian football, from British football, from German football, from Spanish football. It's culturally specific, but acknowledges that there are these universal general rules that apply to everybody.
Last week we talked about how people recognize objects and really how well people recognize objects, given how difficult the problem is, given how objects can be seen in all different sorts of illumination, in different positions, in different angles. And yet we are able to extract that information. We are able to take the visual stuff out there, interpret it in a way that allows us to recognize all the different things that we can see in our environment. Today we're going to kind of carry on looking at that. We're going to look at what's really a special class of objects. That's the human face. We're going to look at how we recognize human faces and how we do it quite as well as we do. We're really expert at recognizing faces. So again, we can think about how do we take that visual information and how do we transfer it into a form which allows us to put a name to a face and to do all the other clever things we can do with faces. So I'm going to start off again by just pointing out that it's a hard problem. Face recognition is a hard problem, and it's a clever thing we do. If you think about all the different types of faces you can recognize and all the different types of information you can get from the face, you kind of start to appreciate how well we can do face recognition. But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today, you can see that, again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once. It just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now, this is interesting, because what we know about the Romans is when they left to their own devices and they could build the city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structured it in a very methodical way. That was basically based on military strategy and military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise. And they were everywhere. They went on their various campaigns, their various military campaigns. They would build camps, and these camps were always laid out in a very geometrical plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular.
Child language acquisition, 3 little words. So let's take them one at a time. Child. When do you start being a child? For many people, language acquisition starts at around about 12 months when kids say their first word, but don't forget the first year. That first year of life is very important as well, and indeed before you're born, remember, there are a couple of months before you're born when you're actually able to perceive in the womb something of the language that's around you. So language acquisition starts earlier than most people think. And it also ends later than most people think. When does child language acquisition stop? Well, in a sense, you know, we're all children. We stay being children all our lives. There's no obvious end point. For learning sounds, of course, there is, and for learning grammar, there is, but vocabulary, I mean, that goes on for the rest of our lives. 1 million or more words in English, and most of us only have a vocabulary of 50, 60, 70,000 words or whatever it is, and so there's always something more to learn. So remember that the two ends of child language acquisition are wider apart than some people think, and that means there's more scope for studying it than most people think.
Most Americans take energy for granted, but for many families, maintaining access to reliable and affordable energy is a persistent challenge and a significant material hardship. This is a problem referred to as energy insecurity, and it affects millions of American households each year. We have found that energy insecurity is a growing and vexing problem among low-income households, and the COVID-19 pandemic has made this problem worse. Our analysis finds that there are disparities in the rates of energy insecurity across various socio-demographic groups. Black and Hispanic households, for example, are significantly more likely to experience energy insecurity and face utility disconnection than white households. So too are households with young children, individuals that require electronic medical devices, and those in dwellings with inefficient or poor conditions. Households that cannot pay for energy are unable to power electronic learning or medical devices, keep perishable, healthy food in the refrigerator, or maintain safe body temperatures. Under conditions of extreme heat or cold, people can suffer from mental and physical health consequences, including the possibility of death. Strategies for coping with uncomfortable temperatures, such as burning trash or sitting in one's car with the heat running, can lead to tragic outcomes as well. Our research underscores the importance of public policy that targets energy insecurity and its underlying causes. Weatherization assistance, incentive for residential solar power, energy bill assistance, and utility disconnection protections are all viable strategies for helping the millions of households across the country that are currently unable to pay their energy bills. Mars is fourth planet from the Sun and the second smallest planet in the solar system after Mercury, named after the Roman god of war. It is often referred to as a red planet because the iron oxide prevalent on its surface gives it a reddish appearance. Mars is a terrestrial planet with a thin atmosphere, having surface features reminiscent both of the inner crater of the Moon and the volcanoes, valleys, deserts, and polar ice caps of the Earth. The rotational period and the seasonal cycles of the Mars are likewise similar to those of Earth, as it was the tilt that produces the seasons. Mars is the site of the Olympus Mons, the largest volcano and the second largest known mountain in the solar system, and the Valles Marineris, one of the largest canyons in the solar system. Until the first successful Mars flyby in 1965 by Mariner 4, many speculated about the presence of liquid water on the planet's surface. This was based on observed periodic variation in the light and dark patches, particularly in the polar latitude, which appeared to be seas and continents. Geological evidence gathered by the unmanned mission suggested that Mars once have large scale of water coverage on the surface on some earlier stages of existence. People forget things every day, including experiences, feelings, and thoughts. We call this process biological forgetting. Remembering is hard for people, and people try to overcome biological forgetting. Human memory is not fixed, but it can be reconstructed and shaped by the past. Since ancestors, we have always been trying to improve our memory.
Wilson came then from a different world, and he became the focal point of a broad mainstream American culture that thought that modern literature and wanted modern literature to be able to be read and appreciated by ordinary people. They were not modernists in an abstract sense, and certainly some of them, like T.S. Eliot and Faulkner, were too difficult for some of their writings to be read by ordinary people. But this was a world before the division between the brows or between elite or whatever had established itself as part of our consciousness. Wilson was a major player in the successful effort of his generation to establish at the heart of American life an innovative literature that would equal the great cultures of Europe. And he knew that the great cultures of Europe were there. He was not a product of a narrow American studies kind of training at all. He joined a high artistic standard with an openness to all experience and a belief that literature was as much a part of life for everyone as conversation. He thought that Proust and Joyce and Yeats and Eliot could and should be read by ordinary Americans and helped that to happen. Wilson was a very various man. Over a period of almost 50 years, he was a literary journalist, an investigative reporter, a brilliant memoirist, and dedicated journal keeper.
Absolutely. There's a lot of interest in what forms those clouds. Why are those clouds there? Why do they stick around? At the center of every cloud drop is a particle. You can't grow a cloud drop without having a particle there for the water to condense on. The key questions that people have not directly addressed until very recently is what actually forms those clouds. And so the ones that you're looking at over the ocean, it turns out sea salt is a very effective nucleator for forming clouds. So there's a really good chance that those are loaded with sea salt. But as you go inland, you start to have pollution come from all different kinds of sources. And so different sources form clouds more effectively than others. And we're trying to unravel which sources are actually contributing to the clouds. The clouds are incredibly important players in climate change, in that they reflect the light back to space. And so they're keeping things much, much cooler than they would be if they weren't there. They also play a huge role in regional weather. So we're actually starting to see shifts where having more pollution input into the clouds is affecting weather patterns. And in particular, it's actually reducing the amount of precipitation. So we're starting to see drought in areas with super high levels of air pollution.